Hello everyone and welcome to this video on how to solder the soldering challenge. I'm really excited for you all to be here today, and we're going to have a lot of fun learning to solder and doing this burglar alarm. Now I went ahead and got everything out of our kit that I think we'll be using today. And hopefully you don't have to use all of this because some of this is for fixing mistakes, but I think anything that we could ever use is in this little frame. So let's go through some of what we have. First things first, down here we do have two tweezers, one that's bent and one that's straight. We will be using these as they'll help us put in components. They aren't super necessary, but it's nice to have them. Next we'll move on to our flush cut pliers. These are designed for after we solder something to the board. They have a nice flat end on the other side that we can use to cut something flush with the board so that it's not pointy and scraping us. Next, I think our main thing, other than our soldering iron up here, our main item here is these two pieces, which is actually our base of our soldering station. It's going to hold our soldering iron when it's hot, but we don't need to be using it. So we're actually going to assemble this right now. We have our spring system, and on here is two nuts. Ooh, let me try and get you in focus here. Here we have our spring system. On here is two nuts and two washers. We're going to unscrew the nuts, and you'll want to separate one of the washers out. And we'll leave one nut and one washer in place. There we go. So I have my nut and my washer. Then what we're going to do is insert it into this piece of the base, which allows us to add our nut and our washer to our other side. Add our washer, add our nut, and tighten that bad boy down. Perfect. And you really only need it finger tight, but I like to take the little wrench that they give us and tighten it down a little bit more, just because it'll give us some added strength from it twisting around a bunch and doing all sorts of weird stuff while we're using it. Perfect. Now that we've assembled this base, we really don't need this wrench anymore. You can put it back in your kit or set it off to the side. The next thing, we have wire strippers. We'll need these towards the end when we're soldering our two alligator clips onto the board. Here we have a sponge which we'll use to clean our soldering iron tip. Here we have some copper wick, which is used to clean up mistakes if we have any. But to also clean up mistakes, I find copper wick very difficult, so we also have this, which is called a solder sucker. And what we can do with this is basically if we have an issue, it's a little suction pump, and when you have a board, let's say we have this board, and we have a piece of solder that it's stuck on, we'll heat it up with our iron, put our solder sucker on, and press the button. It'll suck up the solder, and it's perfectly fine if you get extra or whatever in it. Hopefully you won't have to use that, but that is a good thing to have. Next, we have our flux, which when we're soldering, we're actually dealing with a chemical reaction, as all metals like to oxidize. But when metals oxidize, they don't solder together well. So what we use our flux for is that our flux actually creates a chemical reaction which removes the oxidation from metals. And so it allows us to add a little bit of extra flux in case we have an issue where our solder won't stick. Now, all solder, which is actually in this little clear tube right here, has flux already built into it in a little core in the center. But in case we need extra flux, in case we're having trouble getting it to stick or something, it's nice to have this little extra tub. Finally, we have our two pieces here, which are our soldering iron and our soldering tips. Now we're actually going to change the tip that came on our soldering iron because I find the tip that we were given in the soldering iron is a little too difficult to use, and there's a much better option in this bag. So in this bag of tips, let me focus you here, you can see the one I've already used, which is the center one. There is a chisel tip, a large chisel, a small chisel. Let me try and get you in focus here. There we go. A large chisel, a small chisel. We have this rounded piece that has a flat end on it. And then we have two pointed tips. We're actually going for this small chisel, so it's going to come to a point, but actually be flat on the end. Kind of like a snub nose. Let me pull this out and show you what it looks like. Here we go. So let's try and get you in focus. There we go. So it's this little piece. It comes to a point, as you can see, but it's also flat. This, I find, is much easier to use because it allows us to get a lot more contact with the board because it's so much wider. So, back to our big open view, we can take this soldering iron, and the way we swap tips is we'll actually pull off the little protective case, and here, we'll unscrew the collet, which is this little piece right here. It might be a little tight. And once you unscrew it, it should slide right off. You can set that down for a second. And these tips just slide right out. You grab your new tip, slide it right on, take your collet back, slide it right on there and tighten it. Now tighten it down real tight, because as this heats up, it will get looser. It's perfectly okay. We can technically tighten it when it's hot, but gets a little dangerous and I don't really like burning my fingers. Now, another thing about these, I've actually colored mine black. I colored my arrow black for the temperature so you guys can see what it is. I like to keep it just about like 350, a little under. And I think that's a great spot to have it. We'll go over if your iron's too hot or if your iron's too cold in a second, because I think that's also important because the temperature might not always be correct on these devices. And with that, I think we have everything that we need to assemble our digim. We have our solder sucker, our solder, our flux, our soldering iron that we just changed the tip on. We have our sponge, which we can actually wet a little bit. You don't need it really wet. You can just dampen it, squeeze it out, and set it right here in your plate. We have our copper wick, and we have our wire stripper and cutters. We have our flush cut pliers and our tweezers, and I think that's everything we'll need to solder. So here are all the parts we're going to be using to build our burglar alarm, which is kind of our practice for our digim. First, we have the speaker. You can see it's got a little magnet in it, so it's attracted to my screwdriver. Then we have two capacitors. We have a transistor here. We have two diodes. We have two resistors. We have a switch. We have our main board, one black wire, 5 blue wires, and a 9 volt. Some of the stuff I want to draw your attention to, certain electronics have a polarity, or they have one positive side and one negative side. You'll see this come up with this capacitor here. The way we mark positive and negative in electronics is that the positive side will always be a longer wire. So with something like this transistor, there is no positive negative side, but there is a metal backing to it, which will be how we denote which way the transistor goes. With this capacitor, you can see it's got one longer edge, one longer wire, which makes it the positive. Something like this speaker, instead of being a longer wire, although it does have that a little bit, it also on the top of it will have a plus mark on it, and we'll be able to use that instead. Something like these resistors, you can see, are both the same length on both sides, so they don't have a polarity. On these diodes, there's actually a little gray line, and you can see here is where the diode will go on the board, and there's actually this little rectangle. That'll be the direction the gray line goes. So there will be a diode here and a diode here. The resistors will go here and here. Our transistor, you can see it has this little cutout on its corner. That means it's the front edge. The cutout always means the front edge, and the way we do the front edge of transistors is it's the side that is opposite the metal. So the metal on a transistor is always the back of the transistor, and so it'll go in facing this way, just like that. Some of the other stuff on the diagram I want to draw your attention to. You can see this is the switch, marked by S1. S2 and S3 will just be two of the blue wires on each of them. A1 is the speaker. You can see it's kind of got a little speaker drawing. You can see the diodes as we talked about, and the resistors as we talked about. Transistor we already talked about. This capacitor you can see is kind of just a rectangle. That's because, as you can see with this capacitor, neither of the legs is much longer than the other, which means this can go in either way. There is no positive or negative to this capacitor. You can also see here this is the standard drawing for a 9-volt battery, which is where we'll hook up our battery connections. Our last capacitor will go right here, and remember this is the one that is positive or negative with its long leads, so you can see on the board they've marked which side is positive and which side is negative for when we're putting in that capacitor. Now you can see here I've actually grabbed my set of helping hands, which are these little two things. Mine will look a little bit different from yours. I'll put a picture up of what yours should look like right now. But I really recommend you use those because it'll make putting parts on a lot easier. If you don't have helping hands, you can definitely do this on the table. It is perfectly fine if you're working from home or if you're virtual, but I really recommend the helping hands. So before we actually get started soldering, I want to do a little bit of a practice so we know what it feels like to solder. So I'm going to take one of our resistors, which can either go in R1 or R2, and we're actually going to set it up to be soldered. So we're going to take it and we stick it through one of the holes. Actually, let me zoom you in here. So we're going to take it and stick it through one of these holes, and it should slide right through. So you should have it sitting in there like this now. Now we're going to take it and lift it up just enough so it gets a little bit of clearance, and you can fold it over. So now you have it going like this. Now that you have that, I like to measure out the other side, so I look for where the other hole is, right there, and I'll just mark it with my finger, and then I can bring my nails up to it and pull this out. Once it's pulled out, I take it and I bend the other side over my nail, and I get something like this, so it should be a little N shape. Once it's like that, we can go back and put it back through each hole. And that should be set up. So now it's coming through both sides, and it's lined right up with R1. It doesn't have to be exactly on the picture. To help the resistor hold in its place, I like to bend these outwards, just like this. That way it doesn't move up and down and it won't fall. So now we'll hook it back in to our helping hands. And now we'll go over some of the stuff for soldering. So I don't have my soldering iron plugged in right now, it's just perfectly cold, but I'd like you to be able to see it. And then I'm also going to grab my solder out of my tube here. So I'm going to pull off the cap and slide the solder out. Now what I like to do with my solder is I like to pull a big long strand of it so that I can hold it and control it from far away. And now when I'm soldering, what I'll do is I'll take and I'll push my iron and set it flat against the board, and I'll also push right up against this rod, because we want to heat up this rod, but we also want to heat up the pad that this rod is going to. On the other side, I'll push with my solder and it'll go just like this. And so as the rod and the pad heats up, it'll start melting the solder and the solder will melt right to it. If you're having trouble getting the solder to melt, you can always touch it to the iron, which will help the iron get a bigger blob of solder on it, which will help it connect to this rod and this pad and give more heat. One of the other things, if your tip is like dark and black, kind of like mine is, and not shiny and silver, what I like to do is put the solder on it and douse it with a bunch of solder until it gets kind of a big bubble, and then I'll go and I'll wipe it on my sponge and just quickly dab it. It'll sizzle a bit as you do that, but that will really help clean it up, and it should turn like a nice bright silver. Now if you're working in the lab, I actually don't recommend the sponge. One of the things you'll have in the lab should look like this little pot here. And this little pot does the exact same thing as the sponge, but you can stick it into these fibers of copper or brass, depending on which one you have, and that'll actually clean the tip a lot easier. One of the reasons we recommend that instead of the sponge is that the sponge is really cold because it's covered in water, and the tip of the soldering iron is really hot, which can often thermal shock the tip. And when you thermal shock the tip, it kind of reduces the life of the tip. Not enough to be significant, but as we're running more and more labs here, and we're using these soldering irons more and more, it can actually become quite a detriment for us. So now, I'm going to put my soldering iron back in its holder. I'm going to plug in my iron, and it should start heating up. If you're working at the lab, once you plug in the iron, there will be a switch on the side. You'll hit that switch and that'll do the same thing, start heating it up. You can see it'll say the temperature on it, and then it'll start rising in temperature. You don't have to start it until you're ready to solder, because they heat up really, really fast. So my iron is plugged in and heating up. And the way I like to see how it's doing with heating up is I like to put my solder on it and just kind of rub it back and forth, and as it heats up, the solder will eventually melt. And that's when I know it's hot enough. This is also known as priming. Now, one of the things we can do here is if your solder really isn't melting or not looking like it's melting, you can grab your tub of flux, like we talked about, and just dip the iron in a little bit. And now it's covered in flux, which will help remove that chemical process. Now it's smoking a little bit. That's just the flux heating up. And you can see right away my solder now sticks to this. And so I'm first going to douse my needle in a bunch of solder, and I'm going to wipe it on my sponge or dip it in my shavings, and you can see I get a nice silver tip here. Now that I have that silver tip, I'm going to put it just like we did and press my solder to the other side, and you can see it kind of goes up onto this edge, and then it starts going down on the pad. You really don't need much. You just need enough to make kind of a mountain shape, and then you're done, and you can move to the next one. Now, one of the things I see often that's a struggle for people is not getting enough heat on the joint. You can do that, and sometimes it'll look kind of scratchy. I'm going to try and get some to work like that. If you don't have enough heat, ooh, come on. Okay, we'll get it on the next one. But you can see I've got these two sides, and I'll actually pull them off for you to look in a second. Now, sometimes you can add too much solder. If you add too much solder, I'll show you what that looks like. It kind of looks like a big ball. Let me get you in focus. So you can see if you add too much solder, it'll kind of look like a big ball. So what we do with that is we'll just take and melt it with our rod again, and you can actually slide some of the solder up the side. And that'll help remove a lot of that balled solder. And it'll actually go onto that rod, as you can see. And then you'll get kind of a nice little mountain shape as we were looking for. Then I dip my rod back in to the wire or wipe it on the sponge so it's nice and silvery. I'll touch it to my flux or my rosin in my tub, and I'll put it back in the holder and turn off my soldering iron. So you either unplug it if you're using the remote kit that I am, or you can just flip the switch on the ones that are in the lab. Congratulations, we've soldered our first joint. I'm going to pull this off so you can see what it looks like. And you can see on the one where we put just the right amount of solder, we get this nice little mountain shape going up the rod. Where we have too much solder, you do still kind of get that mountain shape because we wiped off enough of it for it to be like that. But you can still see there is quite a lot of solder there. That won't be an issue, we'll just cut off the extra. So we'll use our flush cut pliers. And I like to put my finger on the end of these because if you don't, they go flying and then it's a big mess all over the place. So with your finger on the end and your flush cut pliers, you can come in and get it so your pliers are kind of level with the piece. And you can just squeeze a little bit, make sure to hold your finger here, and it'll snap off just like that. And you can drop that out of the way. We'll have a spot for you to clean that up when we're done. Here you can see we don't really want to just go in at the top because that's a really big piece. So we'll actually come down and cut through some of the solder. That is perfectly fine. And we'll come through and we'll cut off some of the solder. Hold your finger up here, hold your board. And it was a little bit tougher, but we got through it. And that is a perfectly cut solder job. Now you can see this one's still a little big, and we're going to have to solder through these holes. So I'm actually going to come back in here and cut this a little bit more. You can see I've actually cut too much. So sorry about that, my camera actually cut off. But something that interesting has happened. This is actually really rare, but it can actually happen if you scrape it or you get a bad board in production. As you can see here, I have actually taken the pad that would normally be this silver part on one of these boards, and it has fallen off. Now, when the pad falls off like this, there really is no way to fix this. We'll actually have to get another board. For this demo, I'm going to keep using this board so we can save more boards for you guys, but you'll know that this board actually won't work in the end, and I'll show one of my other boards that have been made when we're done. So next we're going to do the other two diodes and a resistor so that we can finish all three of these. Now remember on your diode that there is one silver bar, and you'll have to line up that silver line with the block on the diagram. Now sometimes your diode might be rubbed off a little bit like this one. If you can't decipher it, feel free to bring it to your lab coordinator and they can either tell you which way it actually goes, or they can get you a new one if it's required. Now, so we're going to use this resistor that's nice and brightly colored so we can see which way it goes, and remember to slide it all the way through this hole, lift it up a little bit, and bend it over. It'll line nicely up like that, and then measure out the other part with your fingers, take it, and bend it over that nail so you get a nice little N. Now it doesn't always have to be perfectly centered in this N. I just like to do that because I have a lot of practice with it and I think it looks nice, but if it doesn't always line up that way, that is perfectly fine. Remember to bend these out, and then you should be set there. Let's do our resistor in this R2 spot, and we're going to do the same thing. Push it through, lift it up, and fold it over. Measure it out with your finger and lift it out. Fold it over that finger. Get your nice little N. Put it back through that side, and put it through this side, and slide it right down. Remember on the back side to fold your legs out. And then we do our last diode. Now this diode's a little hard to tell which way it goes, but I can tell you that the line is this way when I'm looking at it really closely. So that's the way we'll set it in. We can put it through there, lift it up a little bit and bend it over. Measure out the other side with our fingers, fold it over our fingers, and put it through both of these holes to line it up nicely. Now we can bend out those legs, and you'll see as I'm bending out these legs here that they're kind of in the way of the other two, so you'll have to remember that. We'll do a little bit of finagling to get that all set up. And now you're ready to solder those two. So because we're ready to solder those two, flip your switch or plug in your soldering iron and grab some of your solder. Now if your tab is short like this, don't forget to grab some more solder and pull it out into a nice line so that you can hold your hand back away from the solder. Grab your soldering iron. I like to dip it in a little bit of flux because it's been sitting there for a little bit for me. And we'll start waiting for it to heat up. Okay, so now my solder started melting. You can see I get a nice big blob of solder on there, like that, and I'll dip it in my wires or wipe it on my sponge. Now it's nice and shiny silver. And I can put it through here and add a little bit of solder. Make sure to touch the wire and the pad so that the pad heats up enough. And you can see I've got a nice connection, but it's not all the way across the pad. So I'm actually going to add some heat to this side and get it to cover the entire pad so that you get a nice circle. Now we're going to go to this one, do the same thing. Add a little bit of solder and just touch our soldering iron there. You can see we get a nice little solder there. Same thing over here. Touch the pad, touch the iron, heat up the pad and add enough solder. You can see I've actually soldered over here. We'll use our solder sucker in a second to take that one off so we can put something through there. Add our solder here. And that's perfect. Go on to this one next. And that's perfect. And then our last pad up here. And that's perfect. Great job. So now we have these 5. You can see I actually put some solder here on accident. So I'll grab my solder sucker, which you can remember is this thing with the pump. We'll take and we'll squeeze it down like this. And when you want to suck, you press that button. So we'll take and we'll heat up this solder with our iron. Put our solder sucker right next to it and suck up that solder. And you can see quite a bit has gone, but it's not completely done. You can definitely do this more than once. And eventually, you'll clear up all the solder. So then you can get a nice little hole that you can see through, and then that'll come right through. Now you can set your iron back, unplug your iron or turn it off, and grab your flush cut pliers. We'll now start clipping at our rods. Remember to hold it with your finger, or else it'll go flying like that. I didn't put enough pressure on it. You don't need a lot, just light. It shouldn't hurt your finger or anything to be holding on to it, but just enough to hold it there. Now remember, when I'm doing this, let me turn mine. I'm not actually cutting it completely flat. I'm holding it right at the tip of that mountain and cutting it at the tip of that mountain. And that'll keep you holding a nice strong structure while reducing the size of your board. So you can see I've got these little mountains still left, and that is perfect. So we've now set up these 3. The next thing I want to do is attach our switch. So our switch can go either direction, it doesn't matter, and it'll go right in here with these 3 sockets. Now, it's kind of a tight fit. There it goes. And it should perfectly sit in there, so that when you flip it over, it won't fall out. Now what I like to do is I like to take my other helping hands and put it underneath of the switch just to hold it up to the board in the right spot. And now that my other helping hands is holding it up from the bottom and I'm holding it here, we can start soldering this switch. Now these 2 you can see are going to be soldered together, and the top one is soldered by itself. So plug in your soldering iron or flip the switch on it. And now our soldering iron is heating up. We add a little bit of solder to it and wait for it to start melting our solder. There we go, it's melting our solder. Just when we touch it. So we'll wipe that off on our sponge or our wiring, and we can start soldering these. Now make sure you're touching the post when you're trying to solder it, because you want to heat up this post as well as the pad. Remember that you have to heat up both or else they won't make a connection. On this one it can sometimes get cold and then your solder will stick to it like this. If it gets stuck like this, just come back with your soldering iron and touch it and it should melt it right off. Now this pad's going to take quite a bit of solder because it's so big, and it might not look perfectly like the mountains we were seeing earlier. You can see I'm kind of painting with my brush to try and get it to all the corners, and now that it's in every corner, it's perfectly set. So we'll go to this other side, and we'll make sure we're touching the post and the pad, and we'll add our solder until it expands out just like that. These won't get a nice spike because the switch is so short, so they might get a little rounded. That is perfectly fine, you just don't want to make a big ball. If it starts to curl under itself, then you have a problem, but these look perfect, so that's all set. Now if you get that nice big ball, you can take your soldering sucker, like we did before, and suck it right off, and put new solder on it so it'll look really nice. Now our switch is fully soldered on. You can see it's sitting just perfectly. And it looks great. The next thing that we're going to attach is our capacitor, or our C2, which remember is not polarized, so it can go in this way or this way. It really doesn't matter. And so you're going to put it in that hole and this hole and slide it through. And kind of press on it a little bit, which will slide it the rest of the way. I like to press on it just a little bit to get those feet to fully set. And then remember to bend these feet out. Just like that, and that'll hold it in place. At this time we can also solder our other capacitor, but you have to remember that this long one goes in the positive side. So you have to make sure the long one goes to the right here with the plus, and the short one can go in this other hole. And that will slide right down. You can give it a little press, and that'll make a nice little shape like that, and you can bend those leads out too. Which is perfect. Now we're set to solder these two. So, flip your switch or plug in your iron. And remember, if you start running out of your solder, pull some more of it. And then we can make sure our iron's still hot. Perfect. We can touch it to those wires. Remember, if you aren't getting it hot enough, you can always dip it in the flux and it might help. That's perfect. Now on this one, I'm actually going to try and mess it up so I can show what it looks like. Give me 1 second. So you can see this one's actually getting that ball shape. And so what we'll do is we'll actually add heat to this pad, and you can see it comes right to my iron because it really likes to attach to the heat. And we can slide up some extra solder up the bar, and that is perfect. Now we'll go to this other capacitor. This other capacitor we can touch and heat up the pad and the wire. That looks good, although I've got a little bit of extra solder, which is no worries, we can always pull some of that off. And then we go to the last one. I'm going to try and mess this one up too in a different way. So one of the things you'll find is sometimes it'll look really scratchy and dried out like you didn't have enough flux on it. So what you'll do is, if it isn't this nice shiny, but it's kind of jagged and it looks kind of like some old rocks, you can just dip your tip in some flux and come up to it and add some heat, and that should bring the solder right down. You can see I've got too much solder here now that I've actually done that. So I'm going to take my solder sucker, heat it up, and suck up some of that. And you can see I don't even have to suck up all of it, but that was enough to actually get it to the right position. And I can add some heat to the pad and to the pipe, and that is perfect. So we can put our soldering iron back and flip the switch or unplug it, and then we'll be going for flush cutting these. So remember, put your finger there, take your pliers, cut those, cut that, over to this side, cut that, and cut that, and that is perfect. You can flip this around, and that is set up for our next step. For our next step, we're going to be installing this transistor. So that'll go up here into SCR1. And you can see it's kind of not exactly right. So you'll have to take and you'll have to stretch out these leads a little bit so that they make kind of a W. If you pull them out just enough, instead of being exactly straight. So now these are kind of on an angle, which is just enough to get them to line up with all three holes. So you can slide that down, kind of wiggle it back and forth to get it to sit right. And now you'll have to remember that this transistor, the metal part goes to the flat side here, and the plastic part goes by this diagonal cut. And as long as you remember that, you should be all set to flip it over and solder it. Now if yours isn't staying there, remember you can always bring in your other helping hands and put it underneath of it to hold it up. Mine is staying there just fine, so I am perfectly happy grabbing my board in two spots to help hold it better. So now you can flip your soldering iron on or plug it in. Now this one might be a little bit more difficult because you actually have to heat up the entire transistor to get these pads to stick. But with a bit of luck and a bit of patience, remember to clean your tip so it's nice and shiny and silver. We can come to this one. I like to add a little bit of solder to my tip so that it starts connecting to the pad and to the wire. And then I can add solder from the other side to get it to make a nice good connection. And that looks great. So we'll go on to the next one. And that's working, but one of the things you'll see, which we often have with multiple pads so close together, is that they're actually bridging across each other and making one big connection. So the way we help remove that is we can actually get in with our soldering iron and slide in between them. If your soldering iron isn't helping, you can try to wipe it off, because basically we'll want it to collect enough solder from in between those to pull them apart. Once you do it enough, you can go back to the original pads, heat them up, and get them to reflow correctly. Let me try and get you a better angle here. There we go. And so now you can see I'm adding a little bit of heat and pulling a little bit away, trying to get these to separate from each other. Now if you're having a lot of trouble, you can always bring in your trusty solder sucker, add some heat, and suck some of that solder away. And that always works for me. And you can see that worked perfectly. So I'll come back with my solder and we'll go to our third pad. And we'll add a little bit of heat and a little bit of solder, and that is perfect. Now this center pad you can see is missing a little bit. You can see the center pad here is missing a little bit of solder, so I'm actually going to add some back here as well. And that should make a perfect connection. So you can put your soldering iron back, turn it off or unplug it. And you can see here, we've got 3 nice little peaks. If this is a little bit on an angle, doesn't really matter. As long as it makes good connection with those 3 joints, that is all you need. Now this, for me, is going to be a little hot because all of this transistor acts as a big heat sink. So we're going to let it cool down before we cut it. And then in a couple seconds, I'll come back and we'll cut these off. Okay, so it's been about 10-15 seconds. I'm just going to cut these off. You can actually cut multiple at a time. Remember to leave most of that mountain there. I like to make a little pile of these. We can come around and collect them, or if you're working from home, you can just throw those away. Now, all we have left to do is solder wires on S2, wires on S3, wires on A1 with our speaker, and wires on B1. So our first thing we're going to do is solder the wires on A1. So what we're actually going to do is grab one of our blue wires and one of our black wires, and we'll set our board off to the side. I'll actually attach these into my helping hands, and then we'll be ready to strip them. Now in the lab, you might have a pair of wire strippers that looks like this. You should be able to use the 22 and pull those and strip these wires. Otherwise, you'll have something like this, and these will work perfectly fine. I'm going to pull one of these wires out. I'm going to take it and do about 1/4 of an inch, should be just enough, and we'll slide it into position. And then I'm going to take and press lightly right here and spin it around the wire. Now you don't have to press firmly, because if you press too hard you'll snap through the wire. But you just want to get it to cut the rubber. Sorry, I might have to do this off camera just to get it to work exactly how I want it to. But it's this same motion here. I just have to look at it closer. So you can see I was able to push through it and cut it straight off. And then you can just take your fingers and slide the rest of that off and get a nice little piece here. I'm going to try and do it with the blue on camera now. So I'll take this blue and I'll actually put it through the smallest hole here. Take it, get about that 1/4 of an inch, squeeze, and spin around it. Now you don't have to go all the way around, just enough to get it to separate, and then you should actually be able to slide it right off, and that is perfect. Now these will also go into electronics recycling, so you can put them right over there. I'm just going to clean up my workspace a bit. Now we should have one black and one blue that are cut just like this. We'll do the same things to the other side, and I'll be back with you. Actually, we'll do the same things to the other side here. I'll show you one more time on this black wire. We'll take and we'll use the smallest hole here. We'll give it about 1/4 of an inch. Press down on the end of it and spin it around. And once you've made a full rotation, you should be able to slide it right off and get that nice wire. I'll do the same thing with the last one here. You can do these in your hand too. I just think it's easier for you guys to see it when I do it in the helping hands. So in your hand, you can spin it around. I'm spinning the wire actually. And then you take, and you slide right off. You get a nice little cut end on both sides. Now back at our board, we're going to put the black one in this left side and stick it through. We're actually doing this a different way than they do on the picture because this makes it easier to solder, and we aren't really practicing with these wires much as this is not really necessary for what we're doing with our digim. You'll put this one through, and then I like to bend these over at 90 degrees so that I can come over here. When I flip this over, my posts are coming straight through. These are bent over, and then I can actually grab them in these jaws to help hold them in place. Now I'll come in with my other helping hands and I'll hold just the board because that'll help it stay in the correct position. And then these are ready to solder. So flip your switch or plug in your iron. We'll come over here and we'll prime our iron. And then I'll dip it in this wire so it's nice and shiny and silver. And then we'll come in here, we'll add some heat. And these should be fairly quick because it's a very thin wire. Just make sure you're touching the pad and touching the wire. And then I'm actually going to move these jaws because they're a little too close and I almost got some solder on them. But those two are soldered perfectly. Now that they're soldered perfectly, we can go in and we can cut them off, just like we did with all the rest of them. Perfect. Now we'll take, and we're actually going to use this other side to do our speaker. So when we're doing our speaker, I actually like to put my board on the ground and try and get just these wires up into the air so that we don't put too much stress on these wires. Perfect. Now I'll come in with this other helping hands and we'll be grabbing onto this. Now on this, we're going to remove this seal, and that actually opens up our speaker. Now that our speaker is opened up, if you look real close, you can actually see the little plus there. And that plus is our positive side, so that'll connect to our blue wire. You can also see it has the longer post, so whichever one works for you best. I'm going to actually hold on to just this negative post, and we'll solder one at a time. So now, I've got the negative post held, and I've got this positive blue wire, and I'm going to just bring them up so that they're touching each other. Once they're touching each other, they're ready to be soldered. There we go. And you can grab your soldering iron, turn it back on, set up your tip, wipe that off so it's nice and shiny. And then when we're doing wires, you actually want to come up from underneath of it and just apply heat between them and then add the solder from the top. And you really don't need much solder here because it's only two little wires, and that is perfect, just enough. Now, as this will be kind of quick to switch because we're just unclipping that black wire now, and we're moving the black wire into position to solder. You don't need to unplug your iron for this. Now that the black wires are touching, we can come in with our iron and our solder, and we can press underneath of it, add our solder, and that is perfect. You can see I've got a little bit of extra solder that I'm going to try and wipe up here. And worst comes to worst, we can always just cut it off with our pliers. Yep, and we'll just cut it off with our pliers. But those two are connected and perfect. Now that those wires are attached, we're going to attach the other 4 switch wires. I trust that you know how to strip these. We're going to have to strip them at both ends, just like we did with these two. And so I'll see you in a second when I'm done stripping these, and you are as well. Feel free to pause the video and do this work by yourself. Welcome back. You can see I've got my 4 wires on that side done, and done on that side as well. Hopefully you do too. And we're going to take 2 of them and set them off to the side, and then we're going to go and stick these 2 into S2. Now these blue wires actually are for the detector itself. S2 is called the normally closed state. What that means is that these will be connected and touching when the detector is on, and if they untouch, or if they're removed from touching, then the alarm will go off. That's what normally closed means. That means it should always be closed. If it's not closed, it's an issue. So we're going to do the same thing that I've done with the last pair. And I have them bent at 90 degrees. And now I'm going to take my helping hands and come in here and grab these two wires so that they're held in place, and I'll take my other helping hands and grab it there. So now, those two are held in place and ready for soldering. So we'll grab our soldering iron and turn that on, or plug it in. We'll take, and you can see I'm running out of solder here, so I'm going to stretch out some more solder. You can do that same thing when you're pulling it off a roll, and you can see this is really dark, so I'm going to add a little bit of solder, wipe it off on my sponge or in my wires. You can see I've got it nice and shiny now. Sometimes it won't get nice and shiny right away, and you might have to dip it a second time. That is perfectly fine. Do it until you get a nice and shiny silver area, and you have no extra solder. You can see I've got a little bit of extra solder there, so I'll just wipe that off. Perfect. Now we can come to our wires and do what we normally do with our wires, add a little bit of solder and a little bit of heat, touching the post and the pad, and those solder really quickly and really easily. We can take and unclip our wires and cut them off. Just like that. I'll grab this one with my pliers to move it out of the way. And we're ready for our next set of wires. We're going to do the same thing with this next set, although they're now going into the S3 spot up here. We'll take and we'll put those in. These are our normally open ones, which means that these actually won't be connected at the start, but if they do ever touch, that'll set off our alarm. We'll take and we'll grab our wires with our helping hands like we've done so far, and we'll grab our board with our other helping hands on this side to help hold it down, and we'll grab our iron and our solder. We'll add a little bit of heat, a little bit of solder, a little bit of heat, a little bit of solder, and that is perfect. We can cut these as well. Remember, flush cut pliers. Hold your finger over it so it doesn't go flying. And that is perfect. I'll take these and move them out of the way. Perfect. We can unclip him. And we're down to our last thing, which is our battery clip. So, the way this battery clip works is the same way as those wires. They're just really, really short. Now if you have an issue with these, you can always cut them shorter so that you expose more of the wire, but it makes them harder to solder. So I like to try and solder these as best I can this way first. So we'll put it through here. Black wire goes on the negative, and white and red wire goes on the positive. And they're sticking through nicely now. You can see there really isn't much coming through, if you look there. This is our hardest solder. But with all our practice, you should be all set. Remember to grab your wires in your helping hands, as well as your board. And then you can grab your board with your other helping hands. Now I'm actually going to solder these in two parts here. And the reason for that is my helping hands is really close to that red wire, and I don't want to solder my helping hands to the board. So I'm going to solder my black wire first. And that is perfect. Then I'm actually going to take and set my soldering iron down and grab my helping hands and move them over a little bit. Now that the black wires are held in, I'm not super worried about holding those to the board. I just want to be out of the way for my red wire as I hold it in place. And I'll solder that down. You can see you really don't need much time with it. Now when I go to put my soldering iron away, now that we're done soldering, I'm going to add a little bit of extra solder to it, wipe it down, take your tub of flux and dip it into that tub of flux, and then set it back in the tray. You can now flip the switch and unplug your soldering iron. Now, we'll unclip the board, and you should have something. Give me a second. And you should end up with something that looks like this beautiful board. So we have S2, S3, remember from right here. We have our speaker off this side, and then everything else is perfectly in its place. Now with S2, because it has to be normally closed, I like to take these and tie them together so that we can test with S3. Now that these are tied together, we can come over here, and all we have is our speaker on that side, S3, and our battery clip. So you can grab your 9-volt battery and plug this in. And now, make sure your switch is in that forward position, which is what turns it on. And if you touch these two, your alarm starts going off. Now, it can get really annoying, so make sure to flip your switch, but that should be perfectly all set. Now, if you want to use your your normally closed, you can always untie these and turn that switch on. Oops, you can see I was touching those when I turned it on. Turn that switch on. There we go, and now they aren't touching. And you can separate these, and the alarm will do the same thing. And that is how you solder your burglar alarm. Well done, guys!